If you are watching this right now, I want you to understand something very clearly. This is not a campfire story, and this is not a rumor that grew over time. This is a recorded incident that was never meant to reach the public. And what you are about to hear comes from men who were trained to face armed criminals and hostile wilderness, but were never prepared for something that hunted them the way a predator hunts wounded prey. Stories like this do not survive because they are entertaining. They survive because the people who lived through them could never forget what they saw, and some of them tried to bury it so deeply that even their own families never knew what followed them home. If you are someone who wants the truth rather than comfort, if you want stories that feel too real to be fiction, then now is the moment to subscribe to this story and stay with me. Because the deeper we go, the more these records begin to sound less like legends and more like crime reports written by terrified men who knew something was wrong long before they saw it. And now I need you to listen to me not as a narrator, but as one of them. My name was Thomas Caldwell, and I was a constable with the Northern Police when we were sent north into a stretch of frozen wilderness that did not exist on any of our official maps. And by the time we realized what was following us, it was already counting us one by one. If you think you are ready to hear what we brought back from that frozen hell, then stay with me, because what hunted us in 1922 is still out there. The moment our sleds crossed the last marker post and disappeared into the endless white of the northern wilderness, I realized with a sinking certainty that whatever had sent that desperate message from the outpost had already won, because there was a silence in that land that did not belong to empty places but rather to something that was listening and waiting for us to move. The cold was so severe that even the breath in my lungs felt heavy, and each exhale turned into a thick cloud that lingered in the air longer than it should have, as if the world itself was reluctant to let anything leave it once it entered. And this gave me the uneasy sense that we were crossing a line that we would not be allowed to cross back over. Our unit consisted of 5 men, Sergeant Arthur Reeves, who had commanded patrols in the Yukon for over a decade, Officer Samuel Wright, who was known for his unshakable calm, Constable Henry Doyle, who joked when he was nervous, Officer Lucas Hart, who kept detailed logs of everything we did, and myself, Thomas Caldwell, who had always trusted that the law and a loaded rifle could solve any problem, even in the most hostile corners of the wilderness. We had been sent to investigate the disappearance of a remote trapping outpost that had gone silent after sending one final message warning that something was following them. And while headquarters treated it as the product of cabin fever or alcohol, none of us could ignore the way the words had been written, because they did not read like a joke or a hallucination, but like a man writing in the last moments before he expected to be caught. The deeper we traveled into the forest, the more the trees seemed to close in around us, their bare branches clawing at the pale sky and blocking what little light the sun could offer. And every mile we covered felt like another layer of the world peeling away until nothing existed but snow, shadow, and the faint creaking of ice beneath our runners. What unsettled me most was the way our sled dogs behaved, because animals know things that men refuse to believe. And from the moment we passed the old boundary stones, they began to whine and pull against their harnesses, their ears flattened and their eyes darting constantly toward the dark line of trees, as if something invisible was pacing us just beyond our sight. Sergeant Reeves ordered us to keep our rifles loaded and our eyes open, and although he did not say it aloud, I could see in the tight set of his jaw that he felt the same creeping dread that was settling into my stomach. Because experienced men do not fear the wilderness, they fear what does not belong in it. When we finally reached the outskirts of the abandoned outpost, the wind died suddenly, and in that unnatural stillness we could hear the slow, rhythmic creak of a single door swinging on broken hinges, and I remember thinking that it sounded like a heartbeat, slow and patient, as if the place itself were still alive and waiting for us to step closer. The buildings were empty, but they were not untouched, because inside we found signs of a desperate flight, overturned chairs, scattered supplies, and dark stains on the floorboards that no one wanted to identify. And it became painfully clear that the men who had lived there had not simply walked away into the cold. In the center of the main cabin, carved deep into the wooden table, was a single word that none of us said out loud at first, because even seeing it written made my skin crawl, and that word was Wendigo. We stood there staring at that word as if it might change if we looked away, because none of us wanted to be the first to acknowledge what it meant. And yet every man in that room knew the old stories told by the native guides and the northern trappers. Stories about a thing that was born from hunger and cold and the kind of desperation that eats away at a human soul until nothing remains but a monster. Sergeant Reeves finally broke the silence by ordering us to search the surrounding area for tracks, and although his voice was steady, I could hear the strain beneath it, because even a trained officer cannot simply dismiss something that has been carved into wood by a man who was likely terrified beyond reason. Outside the cabin, the snow was strangely disturbed, not with the random marks of animals, but with long, deep impressions that suggested something heavy had passed through. Something that did not move like a man or a beast, but with a strange, deliberate gait that left uneven trails leading away from the outpost and into the thick forest beyond. Officer Hart knelt beside the tracks and measured them with his gloved hands, and the color drained from his face as he realized that whatever had made them was far larger than any wolf or bear that could exist in that region. And yet the shape was disturbingly humanoid, with elongated impressions that looked like fingers pressed deep into the frozen ground. The wind began to rise again, carrying with it a faint sound that I first mistook for the groaning of ice, until it grew into something more, a low, drawn-out wail that seemed to drift through the trees and wrap itself around our ears. And in that moment, I felt a fear that went beyond logic, because it sounded like a voice trying to remember how to be human. We followed the tracks despite every instinct telling us to turn back, because that is what officers do when faced with the unknown. And as we moved deeper into the forest, the light faded until the world was reduced to shifting shadows, and the pale glow of snow reflecting what little sky we could see through the tangled branches. At some point I realized that the sound was no longer distant, because it was circling us, moving with a speed that did not match the slow, deliberate steps we were taking. And that was when I understood that we were not tracking something, we were being led. Officer Doyle whispered that he could feel eyes on him, and although I wanted to dismiss it as nerves, I could not shake the same sensation, because there is a difference between being alone in the wilderness and being alone while something watches you, calculating every move you make. When we finally reached a small clearing, the tracks ended abruptly, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. And in that open space I felt exposed in a way that made my hands shake on my rifle, because there was nowhere left for it to hide, and nowhere left for us to run. That was when we heard it clearly for the first time, a sound that was half scream and half laughter, echoing through the trees. And in that moment, every story I had ever heard about the Wendigo stopped feeling like folklore and started feeling like a warning that had been ignored for far too long. We did not speak for several minutes after that sound rolled through the trees, because it did not behave like an animal call, and it did not fade the way an echo should fade, and instead it lingered in the air, as if the forest itself had taken a breath and refused to let it out again. And in that heavy pause, I watched Sergeant Reeves scan the tree line with the slow, deliberate discipline of a man who had survived too many winters to panic, even though his eyes had narrowed in a way that told me he was fighting the same primitive urge that was clawing at my chest, which was the urge to run without knowing where to run to. Officer Hart stepped forward to examine the spot where the tracks had ended, and he used the butt of his rifle to chip away at the crusted snow as if he expected to find a sinkhole or a hidden ravine. But the ground beneath was solid and flat and unbroken, which meant the thing we had been following had either changed its pattern or wanted us to believe it could disappear whenever it pleased. And that was a power dynamic no man enjoys realizing in the middle of nowhere. Officer Wright kept his rifle raised and moved in a slow circle, and I could tell by the way his jaw worked that he was listening for something more specific than wind or settling branches, because trained men learn to separate the noise of nature from the noise of intention, and the sound we had heard carried intention and almost theatrical delight, like a hunter savoring the moment before it reveals itself. Sergeant Reeves finally gave the order to withdraw back to the outpost and establish a perimeter until morning, and the relief I felt at those words embarrassed me because I had come north believing we were the most dangerous thing in these woods, and yet I was grateful for any excuse to retreat, even though the retreat itself felt like an invitation for whatever was watching us to follow us in silence and learn our rhythm. We began moving back through the trees, and almost immediately the dogs started whining again, even though we had left them tethered at the edge of the outpost. And that detail struck me like ice water because animals do not react to memories. They react to what is present, and the fear in those dogs meant something had come close enough for them to smell it long before we could see it. When we reached the outskirts of the clearing, a gust of wind lifted a veil of loose snow from the ground and carried it in a thin stream between the trunks like a pale ghost. And in that moving haze, I caught a glimpse of something tall and motionless between two trees, a vertical shape that was too narrow to be a bear and too long-limbed to be a man. And I remember thinking in a detached and horrifyingly calm way that it looked like a person who had been stretched by suffering into something that no longer fit its own skin. I raised my rifle and aimed into the gap, and the moment the barrel aligned with that shape, it was gone, not darting away like an animal, but simply absent, as if it had stepped backward into the dark and the dark had swallowed it without a sound. And Officer Doyle saw my reaction and whispered my name like he was afraid speaking louder would attract attention. And I did not answer him because I did not trust my voice to come out steady. We pushed on until the outpost came into view, and the sight of those cabins should have given me comfort, but instead, it felt like arriving at a crime scene where the victims had fled and the perpetrator had remained, because the snow around the buildings was now marked with new disturbances that had not been there when we first arrived. Long, shallow furrows that curved around the structures, as if something had paced them in widening circles, testing the perimeter, learning where we would stand. And when I saw those marks, my mouth went dry, and my hands grew numb inside my gloves, despite the heat of exertion. Sergeant Reeves ordered a full sweep, and we moved cautiously from building to building. And that was when we found the first fresh sign that we were no longer the investigators in this situation, but the subjects, because on the side of the main cabin, carved into the wood so deep the splinters still looked raw, was a line of writing that had not been there earlier. And even before I stepped close enough to read it, I knew it was meant for us, because it was positioned at eye level like a message on a door. The words were uneven and jagged, as if whoever carved them had done so with trembling hands or with claws, and they read, "You came for them. Now I have you." And beneath that sentence, as if the author wanted to make sure we understood what kind of fear we were supposed to feel, the word "hunted" had been carved again and again until the wood was shredded and bleeding sap like a wound. We barricaded ourselves inside the main cabin as the last light drained from the sky, and the moment the door was secured and the windows were covered, the atmosphere changed in a way that I can only describe as claustrophobic dread, because it felt as if the walls were not protecting us from the night, but trapping us inside a place where something could decide when the next horror would begin. And while Officer Hart tried to keep his hands busy by writing notes into his logbook, I watched his fingers shake so badly that his pen kept tearing the paper, which told me that even the man who documented everything with precision had reached the edge of his rational explanations. Sergeant Reeves assigned watches and made us check our weapons again and again, as if ammunition could substitute for certainty. And I remember how the cabin smelled, a mixture of old smoke, damp timber, and the lingering trace of whatever had happened here before we arrived, because the air held a sour metallic undertone that I recognized too well from past scenes of violence. And the longer we sat in that smell, the more it seemed to get into my mouth and settle behind my tongue. Outside, the dogs had gone silent, which was worse than their whining, because silence from animals is often the moment they decide survival requires stillness. And that silence stretched on so long that I began to imagine they had been taken without a sound, and I found myself listening for the scrape of claws, the snap of bones, any proof that something was happening. But the forest offered nothing except the steady tick of ice shifting in the cold. Then, somewhere beyond the wall, we heard a single footstep, slow and deliberate, pressing down into snow with the confidence of something that knew exactly where we were. And the sound did not circle the cabin like a cautious predator, but stopped just outside, as if the creature had walked up to the door and stood there listening to us breathe. Officer Doyle raised his rifle toward the window, and Sergeant Reeves hissed at him to hold position. But Doyle could not help himself, because fear makes people crave action, even when action is foolish, and he moved closer to the covered glass, as if he expected to catch a silhouette through the gaps in the boards. And I remember the way the lantern light stretched his shadow across the floorboards, making him look taller and thinner than he was, which is a detail that still haunts me, because later I would see a shadow that did not match any human body at all. A voice came next. And when I say voice, I do not mean a clear sentence spoken in a human rhythm, because what we heard was an imitation, like an actor who had listened to people speak from behind a curtain and learned how to shape the sounds without understanding the meaning. And it spoke from the darkness directly outside the cabin in a tone that was almost polite, as if it were trying out manners for fun. And it said, "Constable Caldwell, open the door." Every hair on my body lifted, because I had not said my name out loud since we arrived. And I knew with absolute certainty that none of my men would use that exact form of address in that exact tone. And the worst part was that the voice did not sound monstrous. It sounded close enough to human that it triggered the oldest fear in the world, which is the fear that something inhuman can stand beside you wearing a human voice like borrowed clothing. Sergeant Reeves demanded to know who was there, and for a moment there was only silence. And then the voice returned with a faint amused breath behind it, as if it enjoyed the idea of us trying to reassert authority. And it said, "You came because they claimed they were hunted." And then it paused like it was savoring the words, and it continued, "Now you will claim the same." At that point, Officer Wright did something that I still respect, because he did not shout and he did not beg, and instead he moved with deliberate control to the back window and pulled one board aside just enough to look out. And I saw his face tighten as if he had looked into something that hurt his eyes, and he stepped backward so fast his shoulder slammed into the wall, and when I demanded to know what he saw, he did not answer immediately, because some images do not fit into language on the first try. Finally, he whispered that there was a figure standing in the snow, taller than any man, too thin, too still, with its head angled slightly as if it were listening. And he said the thing that made my stomach drop into a cold hollow, because he said it was smiling even though there was no reason to smile in a place like this, and it was smiling like a hunter smiles when the trap is closed and the prey finally understands it has been caught. After Officer Wright stumbled back from the window, the cabin felt smaller, as if the walls had moved inward by inches, and the lantern light seemed suddenly too weak to hold back whatever waited outside, because fear changes the way light behaves in your mind and turns every shadow into a doorway. And I remember how Sergeant Reeves forced himself to breathe slowly, and then ordered us to keep our rifles trained on the door and windows without firing unless we had a clear target, which sounded like discipline but was really his way of preventing panic from turning us into our own worst enemy. The voice returned again, and this time it came from a different side of the cabin without any sound of footsteps crossing the snow, which meant either the creature moved faster than any of us could track, or it did not need to move at all to project itself around us, and it spoke in a tone that was closer now, intimate in a way that made my skin tighten as if the words were being spoken directly into my ear. It said, "Henry," and when it said that name, Officer Doyle flinched so hard that he nearly fired, because only a handful of men in our world called him Henry instead of Doyle, and none of them were within 100 miles, and yet the voice said it like someone who knew him and had known him for years. Doyle demanded to know who it was, and the voice answered with a soft sound that might have been laughter or might have been the kind of wet breath a starving animal makes when it smells food, and then it said, "You are tired, Henry. You are hungry, Henry. You have thought about it, Henry." And those words hit the room like poison, because every man in the North knows the stories about the Wendigo and what it feeds on, and it does not start with teeth. It starts with temptation. Sergeant Reeves ordered Doyle away from the windows and made him sit with his back against the far wall, and I watched Doyle's eyes dart like a trapped animal's eyes, because he was trying to find a place in the cabin where he felt safer than the rest. And when a man starts doing that, it means he believes the danger is choosing someone, which is the beginning of a unit breaking apart. We tried to stay silent after that, because the creature seemed to thrive on reaction, but silence is also a kind of invitation, because it gives fear room to speak inside your head. And as the hours crawled by, I began to notice small sounds that should not have been there, like a faint scratching along the roof as if claws were tracing the planks, and a slow tapping against the back wall that sounded like someone testing the strength of the wood with a knuckle. At one point, the lantern flickered and the flame dipped low, and in that brief moment of dimness, I saw something that did not fit, because the shadow on the far wall did not match the shape of any man sitting in the room, and it stretched too high and too narrow, with an angle at the top that looked like antlers or branches. And when the flames steadied again, the shadow snapped back to normal. But my heart kept pounding as if my body had seen the truth, and my mind was still trying to deny it. Officer Hart whispered that he could smell something, and I leaned in and realized he was right, because there was a faint odor seeping into the cabin, a mix of wet fur, old blood, and something sour and rotten like meat left too long in the sun, and it grew stronger near the door, as if whatever stood outside had pressed close enough for its scent to leak through the cracks. Then the tapping stopped and the cabin went so quiet that I could hear the ice in the trees outside cracking under the weight of cold. And in that stillness, Sergeant Reeves decided we could not stay trapped until morning, because we had no idea what morning would bring. And he gave the order to make a break for the supply shed where we had left extra lantern oil and a flare gun, because if we could get a flare into the sky, we might be able to signal the nearest post for backup. We moved as a group, rifles ready, hearts pounding, and Sergeant Reeves counted down under his breath. And when he hit the last number, he threw the door open and we surged into the night, and the air hit us like a blade, and the snow reflected a pale glow from the moon. And for a single second, everything looked empty, which gave me the foolish hope that perhaps the creature had left. And then I saw the tracks. They were fresh, deep, circling the cabin in perfect loops, and within those loops were smaller marks that looked like dragged fingers, and right in front of the doorway was a single impression in the snow shaped like a human footprint but elongated beyond belief, and it pointed outward as if the thing had been standing there waiting for us to step outside. The moment we stepped into that circle of tracks, the dogs erupted into frantic barking so violent that their harnesses snapped, and one of them tore free. And that dog did not run toward us for protection the way dogs usually do, because it bolted straight into the forest as if it would rather face wolves and cold than remain near whatever had marked that snow. And watching an animal choose the dark over us was the first time that night I felt something close to despair. Sergeant Reeves shouted for us to move, and we ran in a tight formation toward the supply shed, boots punching through crusted snow, breath tearing in our throats, rifles held high. And as we ran, I heard the most horrifying sound I have ever heard in my life, because it was the sound of something matching our pace without effort, not crashing through brush like a bear, but gliding through the trees with long, measured steps. And I could not see it clearly, but I could feel its presence shifting alongside us like a shadow that had learned how to move independently from the body that cast it. Officer Wright was the first to fire, and the shot shattered the night and echoed across the frozen land. And for a second the sound gave me courage, because loud noises make you feel less powerless. And then the echo died, and we realized the shot had hit nothing, because there was no yelp, no thud, no movement, only silence, and then that same long wail that sounded like a human voice stretched until it broke. We reached the shed and Reeves forced the door open, and we piled inside, and Hart grabbed the flare gun and fumbled with it because his hands were shaking too hard to work the mechanism. And while he struggled, I found myself staring at the thin cracks between the planks, because the moonlight outside was enough to show shapes, and I knew something was out there watching the cracks the way a man watches the keyhole of a locked door. Hart finally loaded the flare, and he aimed it upward through a small gap near the roof, and when he fired, the flare screamed into the sky and burst into a harsh white bloom that turned the snowfield outside into daylight for several seconds, and in that sudden brightness we saw it. It stood at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still, and it was taller than any man, impossibly thin, with limbs that looked stretched and wrong, and its head was angled down as if it were studying us. And what made my blood freeze was that it did not look like a beast charging or snarling. It looked like an intelligent thing observing a set of trapped animals, calm and certain and patient. And in that flare light, its skin looked like pale bark stretched over bone, while parts of its body seemed covered in wet, dark fur that clung in patches like something growing in the wrong places. I saw antler-like shapes rising from its skull, but they were not majestic like a deer's antlers, because they looked like broken branches, jagged and uneven, and its mouth was open slightly, revealing teeth that were not neatly arranged like a wolf's teeth, but irregular and crowded like a hunger that never ends. And when it lifted one hand, I saw fingers that were too long and too jointed, ending in black claws that reflected the flare light with a dull shine. For a moment, none of us moved, because the human brain freezes when it sees something it cannot categorize. And then Officer Doyle made the mistake that ended any chance of this staying controlled. because he whispered that it looked like his father, and when I turned to him I saw tears streaming down his face, and he stared out through the crack as if the creature had reached inside his head and pulled out a memory to wear like a mask. The flare began to die, and the light faded, and as it faded the creature did not retreat. It simply blended back into the darkness like it belonged there, and when the last glow vanished, the wailing stopped and the forest returned to silence. But that silence did not feel like relief, because now we knew that the thing was real, and that it had allowed us to see it only when it wanted to be seen. Sergeant Reeves ordered Hart to reload the flare gun, but we only had one flare left, and as we checked supplies we realized something worse, because the shed did not hold enough fuel or food for a prolonged standoff, and the outpost itself was now a trap we had already fallen into, which meant our only option was to attempt the long trek south through the forest in the dark, while something that did not tire followed our tracks with amusement. And then, as if to confirm that it was listening to every thought we had, the voice returned, closer than ever, not outside this time but above us on the roof, and it spoke softly, almost tenderly, and it said, "Run, because I love the hunt." When the voice spoke from the roof, every instinct in my body screamed that we were no longer dealing with something bound by physical limits, because no creature that moves on legs should be able to be above us one moment and beside us the next without making a sound, and yet the boards above our heads creaked under a weight that was far heavier than any man, and I could hear the slow, deliberate shifting as if it were pacing in a small circle, savoring the knowledge that it was directly over us, while we huddled like animals in a trap. Sergeant Reeves ordered us to leave the shed and head south immediately, because staying still only made us easier to study, and although the order was sound, I could tell that it was also born of desperation, because men do not like to admit when they have been outmaneuvered, and we had been outmaneuvered from the moment we followed those tracks into the forest. We burst out of the shed and into the snow, and this time we did not even pretend to move quietly, because stealth is useless when something already knows where you are, and we ran with everything we had, breath tearing at our throats, legs burning, rifles clutched tight as if wood and metal could protect us from something that did not obey the same rules of reality we did. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in front of us, and I could barely tell one tree from another as the darkness closed in. But what I could tell was that the sound of pursuit never faded, because no matter how fast we ran, there was always that faint rhythmic crunch of snow behind us, unhurried and confident, like footsteps belonging to a thing that knew we would tire long before it did. Officer Hart began to lag behind, and I called out to him to keep moving, but he did not answer. And when I glanced back, I saw him stumbling, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his face pale with exhaustion and fear, and Sergeant Reeves ordered Wright to stay with him, which was the right decision in theory but the worst decision in practice, because splitting up in the dark only made it easier for the hunter to isolate its prey. The moment Wright slowed to support Hart, the sound behind us changed, because it drew closer, and I felt a wave of cold sweep over my back as if something massive had passed through the space just behind me. And when I looked back again, Wright and Hart were no longer where they had been a second before, and the forest between us was empty and still, as if they had simply been erased. We stopped and called their names, but there was no answer, and I knew in my bones that if they were gone there would be no bodies to find, because predators like this do not leave evidence, they leave absence, and that absence felt heavier than any corpse. Officer Doyle began to sob quietly, and Sergeant Reeves grabbed him by the collar and told him to hold it together, but fear had already cracked something inside Doyle, and I could see it in his eyes, because they were darting around as if he expected to see Wright and Hart stepping out of the trees, even though we both knew they would not. We kept moving, slower now, because the cold and the terror were draining us, and as we moved I began to hear whispers that did not belong to the wind, soft voices calling my name in tones that sounded like people I had loved and lost, and I realized with horror that the creature was not just chasing us, it was trying to separate us from our own memories, to make us doubt what was real and what was part of its game. At one point I heard my mother's voice calling to me from the left side of the trail, and for a terrible moment I wanted to follow it, because grief can be as powerful a lure as hunger, but I forced myself to keep my eyes forward and my feet moving, because something that wears the voices of the dead cannot be anything but a liar. The forest suddenly opened into a narrow ravine, and Sergeant Reeves ordered us to cross it quickly, because narrow spaces can sometimes break a pursuit. But as we descended into that cold shadow, I felt the air change again, thick and heavy, and I knew the creature had planned this route long before we ever stepped onto it. The ravine was choked with snow and fallen branches, and as we struggled through it, I could hear the thing above us moving along the ridge with effortless speed, and that realization was worse than seeing it, because it meant the creature was no longer content to follow. It was positioning itself to strike, and every step we took felt like we were walking deeper into a mouth that was slowly closing. Sergeant Reeves slipped on the ice and went down hard, and Officer Doyle rushed to help him, and that moment of hesitation was all it needed, because the sound behind us surged forward like a wave, and I turned just in time to see a shape drop from the ridge with impossible grace, landing in the ravine behind us without a single wasted motion. For a split second, the moonlight cut through the trees and illuminated it again, and this time it was closer. Close enough for me to see the hollowed skin stretched over bone, the dark fur clinging in ragged patches, and the eyes, which were not glowing but deep and wet and intelligent, reflecting just enough light to show that it was looking at us the way a man looks at a puzzle he already knows how to solve. Sergeant Reeves shouted for us to fire, and we did, and the gunshots tore through the ravine, muzzle flashes strobing the darkness, and I saw bullets strike its body, tearing through flesh and fur. But the creature did not fall. It did not even slow, and it advanced through the gunfire, as if pain were only another sensation to be studied, not something to be feared. Officer Doyle screamed and turned to run, and that sealed his fate, because predators always choose the one who breaks, and the Wendigo moved faster than anything I have ever seen, covering the distance between them in a blur of motion that left nothing but a rush of wind and the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. And when I looked back, Doyle was gone, replaced by a dark stain in the snow and a trail that vanished into the trees. Sergeant Reeves and I ran without looking back, because at that point survival was no longer about bravery or duty. It was about not being the slowest. And as brutal as that sounds, the North teaches you that morality is a luxury when something wants to eat you. We burst out of the ravine and into a stretch of open snowfield, and for a moment I thought we might make it, because there was nothing for the creature to hide behind. But that hope died when I realized it did not need cover, because it rose behind us like a shadow that had finally found its body, tall and silent and impossibly close. Sergeant Reeves turned and emptied his rifle at it in a final act of defiance, and I will never forget the look on his face when he realized that it was smiling, because no animal smiles, and that smile was the expression of something that enjoyed being feared. And as it lunged toward him, I saw in his eyes the knowledge that he had always believed in order and law, and now he was dying in a world that obeyed neither. I kept running, not because I was braver, but because I was luckier. And sometimes that is the only difference between a survivor and a name carved into a piece of wood. And as the screams behind me were swallowed by the wind, I knew that I was the last one left in a story that was never supposed to have a witness. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, and every breath burned as if the cold itself had turned against me. And even then I did not dare to slow, because the silence behind me did not mean safety. It meant that the Wendigo was no longer rushing, because it knew I had nowhere left to go. The forest thinned into a stretch of frozen riverbed, and I stumbled onto the ice, slipping and scrambling to stay upright. And I remember thinking that if the ice gave way, it might be a mercy, because at least the cold water would be honest in its intention. Unlike the thing that followed me with patience and mockery, I could hear it now, not its footsteps but its breath, a slow wet sound that drifted through the air, as if it were savoring my exhaustion. And when I dared to glance back, I saw its silhouette at the edge of the trees, tall and thin against the pale snow. And it did not rush, because predators that know they have already won do not waste energy. I reached a cluster of abandoned sleds half buried in the ice, relics of some forgotten expedition, and I ducked behind them, clutching my rifle even though I knew it had already proven useless. And in that moment I realized that fear had stripped away every lie I had ever told myself about control, because all that remained was a desperate animal trying to hide. The voice came again, and this time it sounded almost gentle. And it said my name the way a friend would say it when trying to calm me down, and it told me that I did not have to run anymore. because hunger ends when something is finally consumed. And hearing those words made me understand that the Wendigo did not just want to kill me, it wanted me to give up, because surrender tasted better than flesh. I pressed my back against the cold wood and closed my eyes. And for a terrifying second I considered stepping out and ending it, because exhaustion can feel like a kind of peace. But then I remembered Sergeant Reeves, and the way he had faced the creature with defiance, and I forced myself to stay silent and still, because even monsters make mistakes when they grow bored. The shadow moved closer, stretching across the ice toward me, and I could see the tips of its claws sliding into view, black against the white snow, and I held my breath so tightly that my chest ached. And just when I thought it would find me, a sudden crack echoed across the riverbed as the ice shifted, and the creature paused, turning its head toward the sound with a curious tilt. That moment of distraction was the only gift I was ever given, and I used it to crawl away, inch by agonizing inch, until I was far enough to run again. And I did not stop until the sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, because daylight, even in the north, still carries the illusion of safety. When the sun finally rose, the world looked ordinary again, which was almost worse than the darkness, because it made everything that had happened feel like a nightmare that could be dismissed. And yet the blood on my clothes and the empty wilderness behind me told a different story that no amount of daylight could erase. I stumbled into a small trading post by late morning, half frozen and barely able to speak, and the men there stared at me like they were looking at a ghost, because I was the only one who came back. And the look in my eyes must have told them that something terrible had followed me out of the forest, even if it had not crossed the threshold. They asked me where my unit was, and I told them the truth, which was that they were gone. And when they pressed me for details, I found that my voice shook not with grief, but with something closer to guilt, because surviving a hunt like that feels like betrayal, even when you had no choice. An official search was organized, but nothing was found except broken tracks and scattered equipment. And the report that was filed concluded that my men had perished due to exposure in wild animals, because that was easier to accept than the idea that something intelligent and inhuman had decided to take them. I wrote my own account and submitted it to headquarters, and it was quietly archived and never spoken of again, because institutions do not like stories that suggest the world is not as orderly as they pretend it is. And men who speak of monsters are easier to dismiss than men who admit they do not understand the wilderness they claim to control. Years passed, but the sound of that voice never left me. And sometimes when the wind moves through bare trees, I still hear it whispering my name. And in those moments I know that survival does not mean escape. It means being allowed to carry the memory of the hunt for the rest of your life. I moved south and tried to live like a normal man, but hunger and cold and fear have a way of leaving fingerprints on your soul, and no matter how far I went, I could not shake the feeling that something was still watching, still remembering me as the one that got away. Now, as I write this in the final years of my life, I understand something that terrified me back then but makes a cruel kind of sense now, because the Wendigo did not just hunt my unit for food. It hunted us for meaning, because creatures like that do not merely consume bodies, they consume stories, and every man it took became part of its legend. People still disappear in the north, and their names are added to lists and their faces to photographs, and the explanations are always the same, because it is easier to believe in accidents than in predators that think. But I know better, because I have seen what waits beyond the edge of the maps. The cold is not empty, and the hunger is not just a human weakness. And when people tell you that monsters only exist in folklore, they are really telling you that they do not want to imagine what happens when something ancient decides that you are worth following. I survived the hunt, but survival is not victory, because victory would mean that it was over, and I do not believe it ever ends. Not for those who have been chosen, because something that has learned your name never truly forgets it. If this story made you feel uneasy, then it did what it was supposed to do, because the most dangerous horror is not the one that jumps out at you. It is the one that follows you quietly and waits for you to believe you are safe. If you want more stories like this, stories that feel like lost reports and forbidden testimonies rather than simple fiction, then make sure you subscribe to this story, leave a like, and comment what kind of creature or case you want to hear next. because every comment tells me which door to open and which darkness to explore. And remember, some legends exist because something out there wants to be remembered, and the moment you hear its name, the hunt begins again.